Good morning, church, and welcome wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. We hope that you are having a fantastic day. If we've not yet met, my name is Kevin. I'm the Westminster campus location pastor, and thanks for joining us at Crossroads. If it's your first time here, or if you've been joining us for a long time, thanks for joining us for our series that we're in right now as we kick off a brand new year, the year 2025, with a series that we have entitled Full Life. And that's the kind of life that Jesus has promised us. He promised us a full life, an abundant life, an overflowing life. We see this in John 10:10. This is kind of the passage that we've based this whole series on. It says this, Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it to the full. Doesn't that sound good? A full life? Isn't that what we're all looking for? And yet so often, it seems like we don't find that kind of life. Instead, our life a lot of times doesn't really feel full. It feels drained. It feels depleted. It feels maybe even for you completely empty. Some of us are just kind of limping into the new year. And so where is this full life that Jesus promised? How do we find it? How do we live that kind of life? And why is it that we so often miss it? I think a lot of times our life looks a little bit like this. I want to give you a little visual that might be helpful. A lot of times what happens is we think to ourselves, you know what I need to do? I need to fill my life up. And we kind of try to fill our lives up with accomplishments. We try to fill our lives up with achievements. And the more that we try to make sure that our life is full, that someone says, wow, you were great at that. You achieved that. You did what you thought you were going to do. You're the person that you think you need to be. And we all have this idea of what life should look like. We try to fill our own life up. And sometimes, honestly, we're a little bit full of ourselves. And so we try so hard to fill our life up. And then what happens is what? It kind of feels like the more we try to fill our life, it feels like we're still empty. It feels like we're still leaking. It feels like at the end of the day, the more we try to fill our life up, it still feels like we're drained. And there's a reason for this. We're going to talk about one of the biggest reasons that we so often miss the full life that Jesus offers us, the life that Jesus promised us in John 10:10. And I think we're all going to resonate with this because it's a universal struggle. Even if you don't think you deal with this, spoiler alert, you do actually deal with this. And it's our own pride. It's our own humility. When we're full of life, when we're full of pride, we can't live the full life that Jesus promised us. And so oftentimes what this looks like is we kind of go through our life like we are the main character of our story. Doesn't it feel a little bit like that? I mean, I get it. We're all in our own heads, our own minds, the main character of our own story, the movie of our lives. And there's a way to describe this today. And you probably already have heard this phrase, if you're under 40 at least, and it's main character energy. Have you ever heard that phrase, that someone might have main character energy? Like, it's like the person that walks into the room and they just kind of feel like they're the main character in every situation, in every circumstance. They might seem a little bit full of themselves. You can almost see them imagining the soundtrack that's going along, the epic soundtrack that's going around along with every moment of their lives. But here's the catch. We so often live like the main character, but we were never meant to be the main character of our lives, and it becomes exhausting. We weren't created to be the center of the story, and when we try to do it, so often life feels like it's leaking. It doesn't feel like it's full. And this is not a new problem. In fact, this has been going on for a long time. The Apostle Paul talks about a story similar to this, an experience similar to this in the church in Corinth. And what was happening in the church in Corinth is they were caught up in some main character energy and some main character idea of life. And so they were sitting there striving, comparison. There was conflict happening. There was status happening. They were trying to kind of compare this person to another person. And they were constantly in this moment in time, the church in Corinth, trying to prove themselves. And it was exhausting. We're going to take a look at what was happening in the church in Corinth and how Paul, the Apostle Paul, spoke into this situation and how so often it impacts our lives and how it could help us understand what it looks like to live the full life. We see this in 1 Corinthians 4, starting in verse 1, if you want to read along with me. This then is how we ought to regard ourselves, as servants of Christ, as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. Then Paul says this line, it's incredible. I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Wow. Indeed, I do not even judge myself, he says. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in the darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God. Now, brothers and sisters, I have applied these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, so that you may learn from us the meaning of the saying, do not go beyond what is written. Then you will not be puffed up. Puffed up, that's an important word we're going to look at. And being a follower of one of us over the other, for who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did not receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? Paul in this passage gives us a completely different way of thinking about life, a completely different perspective on life. Paul's life, and he describes it in this passage, is he has this full life. He has this abundant life. He has the kind of life that Jesus promised us. And this is what we need to look at and understand from this passage in order to live that kind of life as we move into this new year together. And I see these three things here in this passage. The first one is the leaky life. The second one is the full life, and then we're going to look at what does it look like to have an overflowing life. And Paul, in this passage, perfectly describes what I showed you before, the leaky life. And so let's start with that. A little bit of context for what was happening in the church of Corinth at this time, because you're hearing about Paul and Apollos, and what is Paul talking about? What's the situation that Paul is speaking into? Paul wrote to this church in Corinth that was divided over status. And some of them were aligned with one teacher, Apollos, and they were like, hashtag Team Apollos. Apollos is the best. And some of them were aligned with the Apostle Paul, hashtag Team Paul. Paul's the best. And both Paul and Apollos, they were both talking about Jesus. They were both teaching about Jesus, but it quickly became a competition, a division. It was about ego and status. And in the church in Corinth, what they were doing is they were striving and comparing and trying to prove themselves one side versus the other. And of course, the problem with this is that it wasn't about Paul. It wasn't about Apollos. It should never have been about Paul or Apollos. It was about Jesus at the end of the day. And so what were they arguing about? It was about following Jesus. And the real issue that happened here is that status and ego and pride got mixed up in this situation. And anytime pride gets mixed up in your spiritual life, it's like poison for your spiritual growth. It is the fastest way to stunt your spiritual growth, to stop you from seeing Jesus, the fastest way to missing the full life that Jesus promised us. It's the one way, pride is the one way to guarantee that your life is going to be leaky, that you're going to try to fill it up and it's not going to work and you're going to be confused about it. Paul is describing this life perfectly in 1 Corinthians 4:6. He says, now, brothers and sisters, I have applied these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit. And then he says this phrase, it's so important to understand because this is what he's talking about. He's talking about ego and pride here. Then you will not be what? Puffed up in being a follower of one of us over the other. This word puffed up that he uses here is actually this word right here. It is physio. And the word puffed up, one way to think about it or one way to translate it, to understand it, is he's really talking about the ego. It's the overinflated ego. What does that look like? Well, there's a couple words that you could understand the idea of being puffed up, the ego. What is the ego? The ego is empty. It is always craving more to fill the void. The ego is always easily bruised. It's bruised by the smallest slight. It's busy. It's constantly comparing, constantly boasting, and it's fragile. the need for success, the being crushed by failure. And so it's empty. It's easily bruised. Just put bruised on that slide. We missed that word, but it's easily bruised and busy. And so those are the things that we see here when we look at ego. We see this picture that Paul describes here in this passage of being puffed up. And so what does the ego do? It constantly whispers, am I enough? Do people like me? Am I winning? I don't know. Am I good enough? And now, as I say that kind of idea, that if you hear that voice, I'm sure none of you probably hear that voice in your head, right? None of you have ever experienced that internal dialogue that says, am I enough? I'm sure, right? But just pretend with me for a second, imagine with me, if you did actually experience that, it is exhausting, isn't it? I mean, to have that voice in your head constantly saying, am I enough? Do I compare? Am I winning? Am I good enough? Did I do what I thought I should do? Oh, I wasn't quite good enough today. Do they like me? Constantly comparing yourself with other people. It's exhausting. And see, when you struggle with ego and pride, when your life is filled with ego and pride, what happens is your view of yourself is always too high, you're too important, or it's too low, you feel like you're not good enough. It's always one or the other. And some people, they struggle with one side more than the other. Some people constantly feel like they are just not enough. They compare to themselves to other people. Unfortunately, that is still your ego speaking to you. Even if you feel like, wow, I don't feel like I struggle with pride. I don't feel like I struggle with ego. As soon as you're comparing yourself to someone else, that's your ego speaking. That's your pride speaking into your life. Some people, though, it's even more obvious because they just kind of walk around. They feel like they're better than other people. They seem like they're kind of puffed up and act like they're the best person in the room all the time. And then some people kind of struggle and they oscillate between one side or the other. They feel sometimes in some moments they like, wow, they have the overinflated image of themselves. They feel like they're better than other people. And then as soon as something happens, they feel like, wow, I feel like I've complete failure and I feel like I'm less than, and just because you were criticized or overlooked. And so here's what we see here is there's this pride roller coaster, or you might call it the pride pendulum, the ego roller coaster. And it's what happens is you swing. A lot of times we walk through life swinging between pride and despair, thinking you're better than everyone and despairing that you're not as good as you need to be. And I love how Tim Keller points this in his amazing book, The Art of Self-Forgetfulness, which, by the way, is a great read if you want to learn a little bit more about what we're talking about here. It's a short book, and it's so powerful. And this is what he says in that book. Pride is the pleasure of being more than the next person, and despair is the pain of thinking that you're less than the next person. And so what happens is one moment, you feel like, wow, I did it. You got the compliment. You nailed the presentation, and you're flying high, and you feel yourself kind of imagine yourself better than other people. And then the next moment, you get criticized, you get overlooked, you get forgotten, whatever it is, and there's this despair in your life, and it's like a roller coaster. It's like a pendulum. It's like the pride pendulum. And you can never feel like you can get off of it. And here's the situation. Whether it's pride or despair, they both come from the same place. They both come from an ego that's focused on me. All of those situations, whether it's this or this, the thing that's constant is it's a view and it's a focus that's on me. It's on me. It's on me. And so here's the truth. The one way to make sure that you will not live the full life is to live a life. The one way to make sure that you will not live a full life, is if you are already full of yourself. The one way to make sure you will not live a full life is if you are already full of yourself. And when you're full of yourself, there's just not room for anyone or anything else. There's not room for God in your life, if we're to be honest. In fact, one of the most insidious aspects of the ego is how it blinds us. It blinds us to other people because we're so focused on ourselves. It blinds us to the beauties of other people, and we're consumed with ourselves. We can't see clearly. And so what happens is suddenly our relationships stop being true relationships, healthy relationships, and our relationships turn into interactions and transactions. And because of that, we miss other people and we miss God. We miss the grace that God has for us. Because when we're focused on ego and we're living out of ego and pride, it's always based on performance. And when you have performance is always about earning love, earning validation, earning your worth. Grace is not that way. God's grace for you does not work that way. God's grace says you are loved not because of what you've done, but because of what Christ has done for you. And when the ego is in charge in your life, you can't accept that. You're just so focused on yourself and performance, you can't see it. And so you're striving to prove that you're worthy for God and prove that you're worthy for what God has already given you freely. And so Paul doesn't leave us here, though. He doesn't just leave us with a leaky life. He gives us a picture of a different kind of life, a full life. And that's the next thing that I want us to see. Let's take a look at the next point, the full life. And he says, and he lays out a better life here in this passage, if we look at it and we study it. A life that's free from judgment and rooted in gratitude and overflowing in God's love. And we see in 1 Corinthians 4:3-4, simple words, but so powerful when you really understand what he's saying. He says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I don't even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. See, Paul uses this analogy of a courtroom in this passage. And I think he uses the analogy of the trial, the courtroom, on purpose. Because most of us, if you really think about it, we kind of live like we're on trial every single day. We try to prove our worth, our achievements, our relationships, our good deed. But the gospel declares you don't have to do that anymore. The gospel declares the trial's over. That's why Paul says, I care very little if I'm judged by you or any human court. Because he's saying the ultimate judgment has already been made. And it's not based on a perfect performance from Paul. It's based on a perfect sacrifice from Jesus. Imagine what Paul's living this life. It is full. Why? Can you imagine a life that's free from the burden of the ego? That's what Paul's showing us here. Can you imagine a life, what it would feel like to live a life free from the opinions of others? I care very little what other people say. Even the harsh voice in our own head, our own inner voice, our own inner critic, and no longer live under the weight. What Paul is saying here is revolutionary. It's a full life. It's a different kind of life. His value, his self-worth isn't based on external judgment. It's not based on what this person thinks about him or what that person thinks about him. Paul's not worried about that. It's not based on internal judgment. He's like, I don't even judge myself. That's not what's important. It's not about what I think about myself, whether I meet my own standard or not. Instead, Paul says the only thing that matters is God's judgment of him and what God says about him. This is so radical. This is so countercultural because the world today says, hey, you pick for yourself. You decide for yourself. We're told to be true to yourself, come up with your own identity, decide for yourself who you are, construct your identity from within, decide for yourself what's important. And Paul says, I don't even do that. I don't even judge myself. Why? Because if you try to judge your own self and you try to value your own self and decide, am I good enough? Am I not good enough? It's always flawed. You always miss it because the heart is deceitful. And we always seem to have a poor idea and picture of ourselves, an unclear picture of ourselves. And so when we set our own standards, which is a lot of times what we do, we say, I'm going to set my own standard for my life. I've got this idea of what my life should be, what I should achieve, what I should be able to accomplish, what my life should look like. What happens is one of two things. Either we think this is who I'm supposed to be, and we hit the expectation that we have. And if we do that, then we become full of pride. Wow, look at me, I did it. Or we set the standard for ourselves and we don't quite get there. We don't quite get to what we hope and expect our life should look like. We don't get the promotion. We don't have as much money as we think. Our relationship, our family doesn't look like it's supposed to. We don't quite meet the standard that we have for ourselves. And then we fall into, and we feel crushed and we feel like we've failed. And so you either find yourself viewing yourself too highly or viewing yourself too lowly. Either way, it's a trap. Either way, it's a trap. It's an ego trap. And here's the thing. The only thing that matters that Paul talks about here is not your opinion of yourself or someone else's opinion about you. It's what God says about you. And this is what God says about you. You are completely loved. You are forgiven. You are free. You're my son. You're my daughter. When your identity, Paul's talking about his identity, is rooted in Christ, you step off this roller coaster, this ego roller coaster up and down of pride and despair. You no longer have to swing between I'm amazing, I'm the best, look at me, comparing yourself to other people, or falling into despair and feeling like I'm terrible all the time. Instead, you rest in this truth that your worth doesn't come from what you've achieved or what others say about you. It comes from God who sees you fully and loves you completely. It comes from a God who understands you and says, you know what, at the end of the day, I love you no matter what. And that is where fullness comes from. That's where the life that Jesus promised us in 10:10 comes from. In fact, I'd say it like this. True fullness begins when we stop living for approval and we start living from God's approval. What a shift that is. And that's what we see Paul doing here. He doesn't need anyone's approval. He's like, I'm already been approved by God, and that changes my whole life. And this is how you do this. One of the ways you have to understand, Paul gives us a picture in verse 7. What do you have that you did not receive? This question, if you really dig into it, and you really reflect on this truth in your life, it will flip the ego on its head. Everything that we have, everything that you have, comes from God. It's everything that we have. Our talents, our opportunities, and even our breath comes from God. It's a gift. It's a gift from God. And yet the ego blinds us to that truth. And it whispers this truth, this lie to us, that we've earned everything that we have. Everything that you have, you've earned it because you did it. And it whispers this lie that you really deserve more than what you have. And grace interrupts this narrative, and grace says to you, you didn't earn anything. Everything you have is a gift. But God says, I want to give it to you anyway. I want you to experience this kind of life anyway. And when we see life like that, like a gift, it changes how we live. Instead of striving to prove ourselves and focusing on ourselves, we start living with open hands and open hearts. It was a gift to us in the first place. We want to give it away, and we want to live with that kind of perspective for the rest of our lives. And that's what is described in the art of forgetfulness. And I would call this, it is the art of forgetfulness. And this is kind of based on this classic quote from C.S. Lewis. You might have heard it before, but it might be the best definition of humility that I've ever seen. C.S. Lewis describes humility like this. True humility, he says, is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. That's the freedom that Paul described right here. Paul described this kind of freedom. When we think about ourselves less, you're not thinking about, how do I measure up? Am I good enough? You're free suddenly to start thinking about other people, to start seeing God, to start seeing God's grace, how he's given everything. Everything that we have comes from him. And we begin to live with fullness and joy and overflowing life. And see, full life is not about achieving more. It's about receiving more. It's about receiving this gift that God has for you. And it's not about a bigger ego. It's about embracing this deep identity that you have in Christ and living out of that. And so here's the beautiful thing about the gospel. Jesus didn't just come to fill us up. He wants us to overflow. That's the promise that we have. Sometimes I think we just think, I want to be full. That's great. Being full is a first step. But the gospel brings something even deeper. It wants us to overflow, the overflowing life. And when we fully grasp what Christ has done for us, it doesn't just stop with us. It begins to overflow from our life into the lives of other people around us. It impacts how we live today. But to get to that place of living with humility over ego and pride, it's going to take some serious self-reflection. And it's going to take, I'll be honest, some reflection that most people don't want to do, because it's hard to look at our own pride. It's hard to look at the pride and the ego that we live out of. It's really hard, and sometimes even honestly painful, to come to grips with our own shortcomings and weaknesses and character defects. Who wants to look at that? Who wants to do that? This is what people in recovery call doing the work. People that are in recovery say, you can't just stop drinking. You can't just stop doing drugs. If you just do that and you don't do the work, you're not really going to be recovered. You're not going to be transformed. You're not going to be a different person. But if you do the work of real self-reflection and looking at yourself and where God needs to refine your life and your character, and this is what Paul encourages us to do in 1 Corinthians 4:5. He says, he will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and expose the motives of your heart. In other words, take a look at your own heart. And so I would start with this question for you today. What would God reveal about what's driving your life right now? Are you living to prove yourself? Are you living in the fullness of God's grace for you? What are you doing to try to fill yourself up, trying to pour your own pride and your own ego into your life? And where do you see that in your life? And where is it that you are allowing God to fill you up in your life? And so here's a couple simple steps that I want us to do. I want you to do the work. I want you to take a little time and to do some self-reflection. And this is just an easy step for you. And I mean, if you can't do this one step, then the chances that you get beyond pride and ego in your life is pretty low. We want to make this really easy. The first thing you can do is to reflect on what's leaking. And so just take a time. We want to give you a tool. We've given you an opportunity to take each week a little spiritual self-assessment connected to the week that we're talking about. This week, we're going to do a self-assessment that looks at pride and ego and humility, and a chance for you to just kind of take an honest inventory of yourself. And there's a number of questions there. They're really simple. It'll only take a couple minutes. Just be as honest as you can and give yourself a rating. Try not to be too prideful. And when you pick your own ratings, right, you want to be honest about yourself and where you are. And this is not a pass or a fail thing. This is certainly not a shame thing. This is just a chance for you to be honest, to say, God, where am I? And then at the end of this self-reflection, that you can find as you text this number right here, you can find this, we'll text it to you. You can click on it. You can do it at your own time. It only takes a few moments. But at the end of the self-reflection, I just want you to ask this question. God, what are we going to do about this? God, I know that there's some areas in my life I need to grow. What are we going to do about this? The other thing that I want you to do, another simple step, and maybe the easiest way to move out of your own pride and ego, is to do this, practice daily gratitude. The first step is to stop focusing on yourself and all the things that you've earned and me, and to start focusing on the gift that God's given you and being thankful for what God has given you in your life. Gratitude shifts the focus from me to He. I'm not going to focus on myself, me. I'm going to focus on what He has done for me. It reminds us that every good thing that you have comes from God in the first place. And it comes from this sense of fullness of life that comes from understanding God's grace rather than trying to strive to earn in our own lives. And this is why Paul brings up the gifts that we received. He understands the best way to battle the ego is to remember gratitude in your life. It's so hard to be full of yourself when you realize everything that you have is a gift in the first place. And so each week, or each day, really, if you can, over the next week or so, I would just ask you to start your day by writing 3 things that you're thankful for. What do you have to be grateful for? Just think about some of the gifts in your life. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's that God's mercies are new every morning. Whatever it is for you, take a chance, reflect, and just write 3 things. It takes just a minute. At the beginning of the day, it can change your perspective. And then the last thing is to commit to an act of overflow. What I would say is just serve someone. Maybe you serve someone and don't look for any kudos, pat on the back, recognition from serving that person. I mean, we have people here at Crossroads that serve week in and week out on different teams, and they're not doing it so that we can give them a pat on the back. They're doing it because they just want to love someone, and you can do the same thing in your life. Just find someone. It could be a small way to serve, and do it without any expectation of recognition, and watch how that begins to shift something in your heart, because you're saying, I'm going to focus on serving someone else. I'm not going to focus on me. So we're about to wrap up. Let me close with this. What if we stop living our lives, our whole life, like we're on trial? What if we stop judging ourselves so much, thinking about how we compare to one person or another? What if we stopped judging ourselves so harshly, thinking, do I measure up? Am I enough? Because remember this, Jesus went to trial, so you don't have to. Jesus was judged, so you don't have to be judged. So why do we live our lives like we're on trial all the time? Jesus did that already. In fact, here's the passage when Jesus, before he was to go to the cross, he was put on trial, and this is what we see in John 18. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." See, at the trial, Jesus' trial, Jesus was completely humble. He was silent. He was silent to the accusations that were thrown at him. Jesus was not easily offended. He wasn't trying to prove himself. He wasn't even judging the people who were judging him. He wasn't judging the people who were going to actually put him on the cross. Jesus didn't do that. The whole time, Jesus, during this trial, remains silent, steady. He remains at peace. Why? How could he do that? Because Jesus knew this truth. He wasn't on trial for himself. He was going to trial for you. So you didn't have to. He was judged, so we didn't have to be judged. And his verdict, God's verdict, is what matters the most. And it was settled, already settled on the cross. Because of him, we don't have to wait. We don't have to live under the weight of other people's opinions, our own inner critic. We don't have to prove anyone or anything to anyone, and we no longer need to prove to ourselves anything. He took the judgment so that we could walk in freedom. And so this is what I want us to see as we get ready to wrap up here, is that Jesus promised us not just a full life, but an overflowing life. He says that if you follow me, it'll be like streams of living water flowing out. And that's what a picture of our life looks like, as it's overflowing, not just full, but overflowing to the people around us. John 10:10, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full, a life that overflows with grace and love and purpose. That's God's heart for you. Let me pray. Lord, thanks so much for this moment that we have as we start this new year, 2025, and the chance that we have to be reminded that we don't have to be on trial every day of our lives, that you've taken the judgment so we could live free. And Lord, we just pray that we would let go of ego, striving, approval, comparing ourselves, and instead we would just surrender to you, or just I pray you would fill us with your love, your grace, your mercy. We want to live not just full life, but overflowing life, abundant life. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would do that in our own hearts, Lord, that we would stop filling ourselves and you would begin to fill us this new year, and that we would find the life that you've promised us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.